The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
We have a special need for a sanctuary like this, to which we can retreat for a time from the daily turmoil and have a place to rest and think under the quieting influences of nature and nature's God. It is not all only through action, but through contemplation that people come to understand themselves.
Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States from 1923 through 1929. Just 1 month before his presidency ended, Coolidge visited Florida to dedicate the Singing Tower at Bok Tower Gardens in Lake Wales. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Less than a year after leaving office, Calvin Coolidge and his wife Grace returned to Florida for an extended stay here at the Lakeside Inn in Mount Dora.
He was a very good friend of Edward Bok, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor, and they had a lifelong friendship. So he was at the dedication of the Bok Tower in Polk County that's still there and magnificently attended. I believe there were 50,000 people there.
Edward Bok came to this country from the Netherlands when he was just 6 years old, immigrated with his family up to the Pennsylvania area. And he loved to write and eventually became a publisher. Started in the publishing industry, worked his way in from the ground up. At 26 years old, he became the editor-in-chief of the Ladies' Home Journal magazine, which was the first magazine in the world to have over 1 million subscribers. So over the course of his life, he was interested in writing and in architecture and in beauty. And at a very young age, his grandmother told him to make you the world a bit better or more beautiful because you've lived in it.
The main purpose of this sanctuary and tower is to preach the gospel of beauty. Although they have been made possible through the generosity of Mr. Edward W. Bok, he does not wish them to be considered as a memorial or a monument. While it has been his purpose to give some expression here to his own love of the beautiful in form, in color, and in sound, he has also sought to preserve the quiet majesty of the trees, increase the display of coloring in the flowers, and combine stone and marble in the graceful lines of the tower, all in a setting surrounded by green foliage and reflected in sparkling waters over which the song of the nightingale will mingle with the music of the bells.
Bok would come from Pennsylvania to spend his winters near Lake Wales. He enjoyed watching sunsets from Iron Mountain and decided to stop plans to build a housing development there by purchasing the land. He hired landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to transform a sand hill into a lush and thriving garden sanctuary. Olmsted worked with his father, who designed New York's Central Park. He landscaped many of the most prominent landmarks in Washington, D.C., and served as the first director of the National Park Service. It took Olmsted 6 years to create the Bok Tower Gardens, bringing in rich soil, developing an elaborate irrigation system, and planting acres of carefully selected trees, plants, and flowers. The pathways through the garden all led to the Singing Tower.
The idea was to slowly reveal things to guests as they walk through the gardens. So the gardens back then, when they were first dedicated and completed, were much smaller than they are today. The original entrance was in a different place. But the pathways were all specifically meant to be meandering, and you would slowly go around corners in anticipation of what you would see next. All the while, you might catch a glimpse of the tower, and then it would disappear behind some oaks or behind some other types of trees.
When the tower comes into view, it is a spectacular sight. The tower is a combination of Gothic and Art Deco influences made of coquina stone from St. Augustine and pink and gray marble from Georgia. It was designed by architect Milton B. Maderi, who also created the Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and the Justice Department building in Washington, D.C. Carved into the tower is a unique combination of sacred, secular, and distinctly Floridian images. The bird, animal, and floral depictions were created by sculptor Lee Lowry, best known for his Atlas statue at Rockefeller Center in New York. Metalworker Samuel Yellen crafted the large brass doors on the north side of the tower that depict the story of creation, as well as the wrought iron gates leading to the doors. On the south side of the tower, Yellen contributed to the sundial that features a bronze snake amid the signs of the zodiac and Roman numerals that display the time of day. Yellen's work can be seen on college campuses including Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, and on numerous churches including the Washington National Cathedral. Tile maker J.H. Dulles created the elaborate floor of the tower and added color to the top third of the structure.
Bach's instruction to Maderi and the craftsmen were to make the tower beautiful and to have it reflect nature. And that's exactly what they were able to do.
Walking through the gardens, a visitor might hear the tower before they see it. The Singing Tower houses one of only 600 carillons in the world. It has 60 bronze bells, the largest of which weighs about 12 tons. A keyboard instrument at the top of the tower is attached to clappers which strike the bells, creating music.
There are beautiful bells all over the world, but there is always something else going wrong. Like the carillon I played before Antwerp Cathedral was in the middle of the city, and everybody, it's the first thing you hear when you stop playing music is noise, because it's in the middle of a city. So it's not nice for a musician. It's difficult for listeners to find a quiet spot, etc. And there. So this tower in this sanctuary is unique in the world. Nowhere else you'll find this. The gardens are like a natural concert hall. No traffic, beautiful peace, serene. I mean, it's a dream for me to play, to perform. And it's a dream for the listeners because they can hear every single note, no matter how quiet I play.
One month after his dedication of Bach Tower Gardens, Calvin Coolidge was replaced as President of the United States by Herbert Hoover, who had served as Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge. Less than a year later, in January 1930, Coolidge and his wife Grace returned to Florida for their first vacation in many years. The New York Life Insurance Company invited Coolidge to present the talk, The Economics of Life Insurance, at their conference in the Vinoy Hotel in St. Petersburg. The speech was Coolidge's first nationally broadcast radio address as a former president. While on the Gulf Coast, Coolidge also visited Tarpon Springs. Since 1905, a large Greek community was established in Tarpon Springs to participate in the booming sponge industry. The authentic Greek culture that Coolidge experienced there in 1930 still exists today.
People have upheld it to an amazing degree for more than 100 years, to the extent that when people come from Greece, they find people here with a more conservative culture than they have in the home islands in Greece. As usually happens with immigrant groups, on the periphery or in the diaspora, they maintain an older form of the culture usually. So people go from birth and baptism and various customs, birthday customs, name day customs, daily food, learning to dance, learning about the music, working in different businesses in town that are related to Greek culture until they die. Greek culture goes with them. They're ushered to the grave, literally, by the priests and with the rituals of the Greek church. It's absolutely authentic. Now, there's always a difference here and everywhere else between what they call um, front door culture and back door culture as regards the tourist industry. Um, uh, Culture isn't really staged here, but it's much richer here if you're part of the community than if you're just looking at the shops. On the other hand, I don't think tourists really take full advantage of talking to people in the community that they might find in Greektown or along the sponge docks. In fact, the sponge fishermen are some of the best ambassadors of Greek culture because despite a heavy workload, they are ready to stop almost any time to talk to people about what they do.
Calvin Coolidge was elected vice president under Warren G. Harding in 1920. When Harding died in 1923, Coolidge became president of the United States and was re-elected in 1924. Coolidge left office as a very popular president, having overseen the economic boom of the Roaring Twenties, although historians are divided about how much his economic policies contributed to the Great Depression of the following decade. In early 1930, Coolidge was greeted warmly in cities and towns around Florida that he visited from his temporary home base in Mount Dora.
Mount Dora became their home, their hub, as it were. But you know, a couple times a week or so, they were definitely going out and about. A lot of support, I think, at the time, um, for President Coolidge and what he had meant to the country at the time. So, certainly a lot of opportunities for him to sort of say thank you, to the people in this area and communities and things that had been so supportive of him and his presidency.
Originally a 10-room hotel called Alexander House, Lakeside Inn was built in 1883 by James Alexander, John McDonald, and John Donnelly. In 1893, Emma Boone bought the property and renamed it Lake House, settling on the name Lakeside Inn in 1903. In 1924, during the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, the Edgerton family bought Lakeside Inn and operated the property for more than 50 years. In 1930, Lakeside Inn was managed by Albert Hurlburt, a personal friend of Calvin Coolidge.
Captain Hurlburt was the assistant to Calvin Coolidge when he was the governor of Massachusetts, and they became very good friends. In fact, when Hurlburt died in the early 1950s, Coolidge's wife, Grace, said this was his closest, most dear friend. She said, he told him stuff he never told me. So they were very close friends. Also, Hurlburt drove him from St. Petersburg here. And I think he had set up a lot of the events. Certainly the dedications that took place here, he was orchestrating a lot of that.
The inn at that time had just gone through a pretty significant expansion period. The addition of the terrace building was sort of the last phase of that at the time. But the ownership of the inn had as happens in old places like this, had changed, and so through that 20s period, that mid 20s period, there was a bunch of new building and whatnot, and the terrace building was the last piece of that, and it just sort of happened that the timing sort of coordinated when the Coolidges were here, and he was asked if he would, and he said sure, and that's how it all came to be. But it wasn't that he came here specifically to dedicate, the opening of that particular building. But it was, I think it was probably very gracious of them to participate.
Grace Coolidge is a remarkable first lady, and I'm not sure is given the credit that she should be given. But she was a teacher and she taught in a school for the deaf, and I think one of their philanthropic projects after they left office and during office even was the Clark School for the Deaf. But she wrote lyrics for music. They have a framed picture here in the hotel of one of the poems she wrote. Very artistic minded individual. And I think humorous and charming in her approach with people.
The hotel was quite social, as hotels were back in those days, So, people would gather, and it's a big lobby. People would gather in the lobby before going in for dinner. After dinner, Grace would play the piano, and they'd have sing-alongs and things of that sort. She was quite engaging with everybody. So it wasn't as if they were standoffish or they just went straight from their room and back to to dinner and back and forth and that sort of thing.
Silent Cal, as he was known, he kept a bit more to himself, and guests were asked, and in that time it was probably much easier to do, to just keep their distance a little bit. Not that he wasn't friendly, but he had, as we said, just gotten out of the presidency and needed some time to decompress. So they were active. I would say Grace was definitely more social. She was known to play the piano in the lobby and host sing-alongs with the guests. So she was very charismatic and very engaging. And they obviously made friends throughout town and attended a lot of events. Grace did a planting of a ceremonial tree over at the community center.
During their month-long stay in Mount Dora, Calvin Coolidge got his hair cut by the barber in town, and he and Grace attended a local church. Among their many day trips was a visit to Florida's most popular tourist attraction at the time, Silver Springs.
Once they were out of office, they came here to Lakeside Inn, but they did a whole bunch of traveling throughout the state. And I think it was just kind of a way to remove themselves from being in office for so long and do some sightseeing and get to the warmth, because it was January and February after all. So it was the perfect time to come and explore Florida.
In 1924, Walter Carl Ray Sr. and William Shorty Davidson took Silver Springs from a small tourist attraction to new heights of success that continued into the 1960s.
There were less than 1,000 people visiting a month in 1924, and by 1950, they had 500,000 visitors, and by 1962, 1 million people were visiting Silver Spring State Park, and that was by far the most visited attraction in Florida at the time. And 1 million might not sound like a lot in today's terms. We have over 100 million people visiting Florida right now, about a year. But back then there were far fewer people visiting Florida. So 1 million to visit Silver Springs in a year was quite an achievement. And that era from 1924 to 1962, we refer to as the Ray and Davidson years. And that's kind of when the Silver Springs attraction was at its peak.
From the 1870s to the present, Silver Springs is perhaps best known for the glass-bottom boats that allow visitors to see under the clear water and view the flora and fauna around it.
As far as we can tell, the glass-bottom boats were invented here. They're found in attractions now in many parts of the world, including other Florida state parks and other Florida old roadside attractions. But from as far as we can tell, they were invented here. And it was a couple of enterprising teenagers that lived here locally that decided to put some panes of glass on their rowboats, and they started charging people for it. And it just grew from there.
In addition to visiting tourist attractions like Silver Springs, the Coolidges attended events including the Orange Festival in Winter Haven. In 1929, they dedicated the 3,500-year-old bald cypress tree in Longwood known as the Senator. Believed to be the 5th oldest tree of its kind in the world, the Senator burned down in 2012. In 1925, Rollins College in Winter Park hired a transformative president named Hamilton Holt, who invited Calvin Coolidge to come to the school several times. In 1930, Coolidge accepted Holt's invitation.
Well, Hamilton Holt was an international figure when he came to Rollins, but not as an educator. He was an international figure for his work as editor of The Independent, which was a liberal news and opinion magazine based in New York, and as a crusader for world government. And he counseled presidents, and he was very well known. And in fact, a lot of Rollins trustees felt like he was probably too famous to be interested in a little college in the middle of nowhere. But he was, and came here, and as you say, was a very transformative president.
Hamilton Holt made Rollins College an innovative center for learning that focused on student participation rather than a system of lecture and memorization.
So Holt came in with these ideas already in mind and introduced a new pedagogy where students would be in a classroom with a professor, and they would do most of the classwork, most of the research and writing right into class, while the professor simply served as a facilitator, moving from place to place. So he called it the 2-hour conference plan.
Holt's emphasis was on the student experience and on individualization in education. And he was a very unhappy undergraduate himself. He didn't like the lecture and recitation method. He didn't want Rollins to be like that. But he didn't think about adult education in the way we think about it today. He was focused entirely on undergraduates and making Rollins a great experience for undergraduates. Adult education was kind of secondary to him. And the way he viewed adult education was more like cultural tourism, because Winter Park was a resort destination, but it wasn't the beach. Wealthy people from the Northeast and the Midwest would come here to spend the winters, and they needed something to do. And the things they preferred to do were special interest classes, lectures, cultural events, that sort of thing. And Holt saw to it that there was plenty of that going on for these wealthy Northerners and Midwesterners to do when they were in Winter Park.
Holt began a process of encouraging any artist, any writer, any historian, any intellectual, any important figure to come to Rollins and come into residence, and he would treat them as faculty members. Sinclair Lewis was one of the first people he brought in, and that actually had a nice benefit when Lewis mentioned Rollins in his Nobel address, 1930. He brought in almost anyone you could imagine. He started what he called the Animated Magazine, which was a day in which writers, historians, sports figures would come to campus, and the program was organized like a magazine. He sat in a tall chair with an oversized pencil and eraser as the editor. He would have the front section with his history and news. He would have a sports section. He would have a culture section, bring writers in for it. And that inspired departments to begin bringing artists onto campus. And of course, this was long before television. So students at Rollins had a chance to meet some of the seminal figures of the age. And that was an exciting time.
We cannot observe this movement without smiling a little at those who but a short time ago expressed so much fear lest our country might come under the control of a few individuals of great wealth. They claimed that the rich were growing richer and the poor were growing poorer. Our experience has demonstrated that the reverse of this would be much nearer the truth.
Well, he had some losses in his life that were pretty significant. And I think he lost his mother when he was 12 years old. And then a few years later, he lost his sister from an acute case of appendicitis. But I think the most significant loss was the loss of his son, from a blister he acquired at the White House. He loved playing tennis every day with his older brother. And in an age before penicillin, he died of blood poisoning. Many people say that changed him, but I do think as a president, and he chose not to run for a second term because of that, and I suspect that's true, but I also see that you see this in his portraits, and I am a counselor by background, but you see this sense of caring and connection with people.
We are currently in the room that Calvin Coolidge and his wife Grace stayed in for just about a month after his presidency. And this room here overlooks the lake. It's a beautiful spot. There's an area where there was a desk. And while it's not the original now, we do have one there because you can just imagine Calvin sitting there writing his letters, thinking about his time in office, and just really enjoying this little cozy spot right by Lake Dora. So today we have a copy of his original registration card displayed outside, and we have plaques honoring both of them and their stay here, as well as a couple of portraits of him.
Calvin Coolidge and his wife Grace both enjoyed their time in Florida, particularly here in Mount Dora at the Lakeside Inn. The former president died 3 years after their extended stay here in January 1933. He was 60 years old. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.